In the last episode of Plug Life Television, we saw what happened to some very old lithium-ion batteries from my very old electric car, when they were sent to the University of Birmingham to be recycled using cutting-edge techniques. Whilst I was there, Dr. Rob Sommerville, PhD candidate Anton Zorin and I had a chat about the battery recycling research work at Birmingham, and the state of lithium-ion battery recycling at the moment, what techniques are available, how they work, and the pros and cons of each. The team also discussed how there's more life to EV batteries than you may think. I'll be the first to admit that the sound quality is rubbish, but the discussion is interesting enough to merit uploading. Hope you enjoy.
This is where the recycling journey begins then, and we've just had a little look inside the facility, but I suppose it's important to discuss the actual recycling technique itself in a bit more detail, and that's where, Anton, you're specialising at the moment in the very beginning of the journey, and that's where you've got your battery pack and your battery modules, and where do you go from there?
So once the battery packs are out of the modules, there's a couple of ways we can deal with them. There is the shredder that you can see in the back. If you have batteries that are entirely degraded or are entirely unusable in the second life, they can be shredded and the material can be recovered. If you have batteries that have material that is valuable, we can try and do automated disassembly using something like this laser behind us, or we can also take the entire module. If the entire module is still fine, we can use that directly in second life without having to do any other processing except from taking it out of the battery pack.
That's a good point, because what's the point in recycling if you can reuse? First of all, reuse is, well, okay, reduction of resource is the number one thing, but then it's reuse, then it's recycling. And yeah, with an electric vehicle battery pack, let's remind ourselves that end of life is 70% state of health, 70% of its original capacity as defined by the automotive industry is what's end of life. But bearing in mind that electric vehicles are now typically 200 plus miles per charge, that's 140 plus miles, 200 plus kilometres easy. That's enough for most people, and if they then choose to remove that, there's still tons of capacity there for grid storage and as you said, second life applications. So yeah, I suppose there's been an issue getting feedstock for this cutting-edge, state-of-the-art recycling facility because of so few batteries actually needing to be recycled at the moment. Is that what you've found?
I should point out that not all second life applications are equal. Some of them are going to be a lot less demanding on a battery. If it's something which is just charging and discharging a small amount each day, that's going to be a lot less demanding than what you'd be putting it through if it were rapid charging and accelerating if it were an EV. So even if it's beyond 70%, you're still likely to get, it's still possible to get a good amount of use of it afterwards being an EV.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely spot on. As you say, the lifespan of that second life battery pack or module or whatever it may be is going to be increased with that much more because it's having such an easy life. An EV is a tough application for the lithium-ion battery, but they still cope enough to be well over a decade's lifespan. With grid storage, yeah, you're easily talking doubling, trebling its lifespan before we get to the stage that we see in here. So obviously there's the shredding aspect, but there's also some interesting ways to get into individual cells using lasers, I believe. Are we able to discuss in any more detail the idea there?
So this is part of the R2 project. This project has been looking at disassembling cells and recovering the active material and putting them back into new cells without dissolving and also by dissolving the active material to return it to its metal source and then form a new active material and make a new cell. But the project has also been looking at disassembling the cell, taking the active material and then putting the active material back into a new cell without digesting it in strong acids.
Yeah, to elaborate a little bit on Rob's point, currently the most two common technologies are pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy. Pyrometallurgy, you stick your cell, module, entire pack into a furnace and melt it down, and then you can recover some of the more expensive metals like nickel, aluminium, cobalt, potentially. Hydrometallurgy, you dissolve your active material up in an acid and you try and precipitate the metal salts that can be used to remanufacture capture the active material. What R2Lib and the Relib project are looking at is something called direct recycling, where we don't go through that phase change, and we try to reuse the active material as active material.
Yeah, so you are literally just grabbing it off of one cell, stuffing it into another one, having done a little bit of restoration, I suppose.
Yes, that's the ideal.
Yeah.
I should point out, for the current recycling approach, pyrometallurgy is a well-established technology, and we have facilities in the UK where we could just put batteries in the furnace tomorrow. We're not going to put entire packs in because everyone will just do some dismantling to get it down to, I believe Umicore's words were shoebox size or smaller. And the pyrometallurgical process will produce an alloy at the end which will contain cobalt, nickel and copper, which are the most valuable materials in it. The aluminium will be consumed and be used as a reducing agent, so will the graphite. The lithium will end up in the slag, and then so will the aluminium afterwards. So these materials will be wasted. Manganese will generally also end up in the slag. So it is a process which is battery chemistry agnostic, because it doesn't really care, and it requires minimal pre-processing. You just disassemble it a bit, and it pushes into a furnace, and then I'm simplifying it enormously, but you get your alloy out at the end, and then put your alloy through a hydrometallurgical process to separate out different metals. Hydrometallurgy, you will use a shredding process first, separate out the different components, so that you only get the active material from the battery, and then you will dissolve those in acids, and then, as Anton said, separate out those materials, manufacture new active material from those metals, and then put that into a new cell. Direct recycling, if the active material, if the crystal structure is still intact, you can take this out and then put it back into a new cell without going through any of what we've said so far. And you can save an awful lot of time, energy, and CO2 by taking this approach. But it requires on a very, very efficient separation process, because impurities will result in a less efficient battery.
Yeah.
And it also requires the active material to still retain its initial crystal structure. If you can't take your lithium ions and put them into your active material and take them out again because your active material is falling to pieces, it's not going to work.
True. It's fascinating stuff. You know, as you say, the pyrometallurgical was the original technique, and that was because cobalt and copper are so valuable. It was a case of, we'll obviously try and get these, the rest of it, as you say, just ends up as slag. But we're now seeing techniques that are increasingly efficient in terms of what they can retrieve. However, as you say, there's the issues with impurities and so on, which are being gradually overcome. And with pyro, going back to pyro, what's the typical sort of percentage of materials that would be recovered from that off the top of your head? Is it sort of 40-ish%, maybe less?
It'll depend an awful lot on what you're putting into your process.
Yeah.
Because there are not very many dedicated pyrometallurgical lithium-ion battery recycling companies. There are cobalt companies who want to sell cobalt and see batteries as tasty little morsels full of cobalt, and they can put that into their process along with some cobalt ore, and that will really up the content of their final product. But they're not really interested in the lithium or the other materials, because they're trying to sell cobalt. But there is at least one pyrometallurgical company that I can think of. It's a German company called Accurec. They pyrolyze the batteries first, so they heat them up inside a safe enclosure under a vacuum. This will cause the binder, electrolyte and plastics to break down and go away. They will then shred it and separate out the casings and some of the current collectors. And then this active material will be put through an electric furnace. Under such conditions, they also have the manganese as well as the nickel and the cobalt.
Excellent.
This is quite a unique process, and this is not common run-of-the-mill. This is not a common run-of-the-mill approach. Most new lithium-ion battery startups will be aiming for a shred, sort, and hydrometallurgical approach, which is what we're seeing a lot of startups in the US taking this approach. And there's lots of research being done on direct recycling, but it's not being done on a large scale by any large companies that I'm aware of.
That may seem a bit of a pessimistic note on which to end, but this is the very point of the Relib project, to develop new, efficient, high-yield EV battery recycling techniques and work towards scaling them up. If you haven't seen the previous episode of Plug Live Television already, check it out now. You'll see that the Relib team at the University of Birmingham are making excellent progress. See you again soon for another episode of Plug Live Television.